We'd been in the house maybe 3 weeks when she showed up. I remember the exact quality of that morning, the way the light came through the new kitchen windows we'd put in during the renovation. The smell of fresh paint that was still faintly there if you stood in the right room, the specific satisfaction of walking through your own space and feeling like every corner of it was exactly where it was supposed to be. We'd spent 8 months on that house before we moved in, extended the porch, deepened the pool, redid the landscaping from scratch because the previous owners had let it go, and we wanted it right. My wife Diane had a vision for the place that she'd been refining in her head for years before we ever found it, and watching it come together, watching the thing in her head become an actual house you could walk through and touch was one of those quiet satisfactions that doesn't make a good story but means everything in real life. The driveway had 2 cars in it that we'd worked hard to afford. I'm not going to apologize for that. We'd moved into a quiet street on the north side of a suburb I'm going to leave nameless for reasons that will become clear. And the lawns were manicured, and the neighbors had waved from their driveways, and everything had the specific texture of a life that had arrived somewhere after a long time of being in transit. There were still unopened boxes in the second bedroom. The contractor had packed up the morning before. I had coffee and nowhere to be, and I was standing in my kitchen feeling, for maybe the first time in a long time, genuinely still. Then the doorbell rang. She was standing on my new porch with a clipboard tucked under her arm and a smile that was doing several things simultaneously. None of them warm. Mid-50s, blazer with the structural integrity of load-bearing concrete, hair cut so precisely that it looked less like a style and more like a declaration. The kind of presentation that takes real daily effort and is meant to communicate that the effort is intentional, that this is a person who controls their environment and would like you to know it before the conversation begins. She introduced herself as the president of the HOA and extended her hand, and I shook it, and I was still, genuinely, in my honeymoon phase. I assumed this was a welcome, a formality, the polite suburban ritual of a neighbor doing the neighborly thing. "You need to pay $20,000 before you complete your move-in," she said. I waited for the rest of the sentence. There wasn't a rest of the sentence. She just held the smile and looked at me with eyes that were already moving to my watch, to the car in the driveway, to Diane visible through the window behind me, back to my face. I know that look. I've seen it in professional settings more times than I can count. It's the look of someone running arithmetic on what you're worth and what they can extract before you fully understand what's being attempted. I laughed. Genuinely, involuntarily, the kind that comes before you've decided whether it's appropriate. "Are you kidding me?" I said. "I bought this house in full." She didn't flinch. Not a single adjustment. She told me it was a compliance fee, that every new homeowner paid it, that failure to comply would initiate eviction proceedings, that she had already warned me I had never spoken to this woman in my life before this moment, and that I had ignored her, and that interest was now accumulating. I asked for documentation, for the bylaw, for the specific line item in any governing document that established compliance fees, defined their amount, identified who collected them, who they went to, and under what authority she was standing on my porch demanding payment. Her jaw moved, just a small thing, barely visible, the kind of micro-expression that most people miss because they're not looking for it. I was looking for it. She gave me a deadline measured in hours, not days. Told me to have a wonderful afternoon, walked off the porch with the unhurried confidence of someone who had performed this particular scene before and found it reliable. I stood in my doorway and watched her go down the front path, and I thought about the arithmetic she'd been running on me, and I thought about what she didn't know about the man she'd just run it on. I'm a lawyer, not the billboard kind. I'm the kind that people call after the billboard lawyer has already taken their money and lost, and they need someone who will actually sit down with the documents. I've spent the better part of 20 years doing that, reading documents, building records, finding the one timestamp or the one email that changes the shape of everything, and waiting. Waiting is most of the job. Waiting for the other side to make the mistake that confirms what you already know is there. I have sat across from people in depositions who were absolutely certain of their own power, and watched that certainty leave them not dramatically, not like in the movies, but slowly, incrementally, as the paper got laid out in front of them piece by piece. I am not describing this to establish my credentials. I'm describing it because it's relevant to understanding why. When Karen walked off my porch that first afternoon, I wasn't afraid or angry or even particularly agitated. I was interested. In the specific, professional way that a person is interested when they recognize a pattern they've seen before and know exactly how it ends. I closed the door and went back to my coffee. Diane called from the other room asking who it was. I said, "Somebody from the HOA. We'll talk about it tonight." She came back that same afternoon. This time, she had reinforcements: 2 men who had the build of people who peaked physically in their early 20s and had been coasting on the memory of it ever since. Karen had printed notices. She'd spent the intervening hours preparing her presentation, sharpening her performance, because that's what someone does when they're invested in the theater of authority rather than the substance of it. The HOA board had voted unanimously, she said. I was already past due. Interest was accumulating aggressively. She spoke at a measured, deliberate pace, the pace of someone who believes they're speaking to a person who needs extra time to process bad news. Then she listed what she called the complications that resistance would produce: gate access revoked, deliveries delayed, vendors advised not to service my property, community amenities suspended indefinitely. It wasn't policy. There was no policy. What it was, stripped of the blazer and the clipboard and the governance language, was a threat, a specific itemized threat delivered in a suburban driveway on a Tuesday afternoon. I told her calmly and clearly that extortion dressed up in governance language was still extortion. That was the moment. The smile didn't just twitch, it died. She leaned in, dropped her voice to something lower and more deliberate, and said cooperation made life easy while resistance made things complicated. And I understood, completely and finally, what this actually was. It wasn't about an HOA fee. It had never been about an HOA fee. It was about the house and the cars and Diane standing in the window and the pool in the backyard, and all of it visible, all of it parked in plain sight, on a street where Karen had apparently decided visibility was something she controlled. She had looked at what we'd built and decided there was something to extract from it, and she had decided with a confidence that I found genuinely impressive in a clinical sort of way that she could extract it through performance. Through the costume of authority worn convincingly enough that we'd pay to make her go away. I laughed again. Not mockingly. Just the real laugh of a person who sees the gap between what someone thinks is happening and what's actually happening and finds it in spite of everything. Kind of funny. That broke something in her. I could see it, a small fracture in the presentation, there and gone. But real. She wrote another notice on her clipboard and left it with me, and took her reinforcements and left. After that, it became a daily operation. Letters in the mailbox, some printed with red stamps and official-looking headers, fines building on top of fines with invented due dates and invented authority behind them. The language got more aggressive each week, the numbers larger, the deadlines shorter. One morning, she taped a notice to the front door like she was serving legal papers, and Diane found it first and read it out loud over coffee in a voice that kept cracking into laughter. And at one point, she made that snorting sound she hates making, and we looked at each other over our mugs and arrived without discussing it. At the same decision, we stopped responding. No calls, no emails, no conversations in the driveway. Total silence. Silence is poison to people whose power depends entirely on reaction. Without the reaction, without the fear or the anger or the negotiation, there's nothing to feed on. Karen needed us engaged. She needed us scared or furious or trying to reason with her, because any of those responses confirmed her relevance. Stillness gave her nothing, and so she escalated the only way she could. She went to the neighbors. I didn't have the full picture of what she was saying. I was getting its second-hand fragments, the way you reconstruct a thing from its effects rather than observing it directly. But I could see the results clearly enough. Neighbors who'd waved from their driveways stopped making eye contact. A woman 2 houses down who'd come over to introduce herself in our first week crossed to the other side of the street when she saw Diane coming. People watched from behind curtains without acknowledging that they were watching. Karen was painting us as difficult outsiders, as people who thought the rules didn't apply to them, as a problem the neighborhood had imported from somewhere else. She was social engineering the block against us, one whispered conversation at a time, and she was good at it. I'll give her that. She understood the specific leverage that comes from controlling the narrative in a small, closed community where everyone's property value is theoretically connected to everyone else's behavior. What she didn't understand was that I'd been documenting every single thing she'd done since the first afternoon. Every letter dated, photographed, and filed. Every fake fine logged with its timestamp and its invented authority cited verbatim. Every interaction the ones I'd witnessed directly and the ones neighbors had described to me recorded with dates and names. The door notice photographed in situ before I removed it, the tape marks visible in the frame, the HOA emails she'd sent several, each one escalating slightly, each one leaving a clean electronic record of exactly what was being threatened and when. I kept the originals and made copies and kept the copies in a separate location because that's how you do it when you've been doing this long enough to know that documents have a way of becoming necessary at inconvenient moments. She thought my stillness was surrender. She thought the silence meant the pressure was working, that we were softening, that the calculation she'd run on us on that first afternoon was proving correct. She was building what she believed was leverage. In reality, she was building my case, one dated document at a time, and she had absolutely no idea. 2 weeks after her last notice on a Saturday afternoon in October, Diane and I came home from the grocery store. We pulled into our street and I was in the middle of saying something I don't remember what. Something ordinary, something that made Diane laugh, and my brain received information through the windshield that it took a full 2 or 3 seconds to process because the information didn't fit any category I had available for it. Our front lawn looked like the inside of our house had been turned inside out, furniture on the grass, the TV from the living room. Electronics still in their original boxes from the second bedroom. Diane's things, personal things. Things with no monetary value but the specific, irreplaceable weight of objects that matter scattered across the lawn with no organization to it, just dispersed. The way things look when someone has removed them, not to preserve them but to display the act of removal. Karen was standing in the middle of it. She had 2 men with her. Tactical vests, the cheap kind, with HOA COPS printed on them in block letters that were slightly uneven, like whoever had made the stencil had done it in a hurry or without a ruler. I looked at those vests for a moment. I remember the specific quality of the thought I had, which was someone purchased materials and spent time making those, and the confidence required to do that and then put them on in public is a remarkable thing to contemplate. Our front door was open. The lock had been forced. The door frame was splintered at the strike plate. The wood split in a way that tells you it was done with a tool rather than a shoulder, done by someone who wanted it to look official rather than desperate. Karen announced, in a voice pitched carefully for the neighbors who were already watching phones out, several of them recording that the HOA was repossessing non-compliant assets pending resolution of outstanding balances. She said it with the cadence of someone who had rehearsed it. Unhurried, authoritative, performing for an audience she had apparently expected and possibly arranged. I raised my phone and started recording. The moment she registered my phone, something moved across her face, a small adjustment, a tightening, and then was controlled back into stillness. But I had seen it. Diane walked forward. I know my wife. I know the difference between her angry voice and her controlled voice, and the controlled voice is the one that means she has made a decision about how this is going to go and nothing is going to alter that decision. She asked, clearly and directly, and without any performance in it, under what legal authority they had broken into our home. One of the men in the crooked vests laughed, told her to step back. She didn't step back. He put both hands on her and shoved her full weight, no hesitation, and she stumbled backward and hit the curb with her lower back and then the ground, and there was a sound, the specific, concrete sound of a body hitting pavement. And every organized, patient, document, everything thought I had been cultivating for the past 3 weeks arranged itself around that sound and then was gone. I went to her first. That's the sequence that matters. I went to her. I checked her face. I checked her focus. I asked her where she hurt. She was shaken and she was on the ground, and she was furious, but she was conscious and present, and that the fact that she was okay was the thing that had to be established before anything else could happen. She was okay. I stood up. I hit the man who had shoved her in the throat. I'm not going to dress this up or contextualize it beyond what it was. He went down. His partner came at me bigger, angrier. With the adrenaline of someone who hadn't expected consequences to exist, and he put me on the ground and Karen was screaming something about controlling him, and I was aware of the phones all around us still recording. And I thought with the part of my brain that apparently does not shut off under any circumstances. Good. Get all of this, get every second of this on video. Then the real sirens. 3 cars. Blue and white, lights going, the sound cutting through everything else and landing on the scene like a period at the end of a sentence. The men in the vests stepped back. Karen was no longer in the center of the lawn. She was at the edge of the crowd. Then she was in the crowd. Then she was harder to locate. The officers were professional and moved quickly. I identified myself, told them I was an attorney, told them I had been recording and that the recording was intact. Told them my wife had been assaulted. Told them our home had been entered by force without warrant or legal authority. One of the officers looked at the tactical vests with their crooked block letters for a moment, just a beat, just long enough to register what he was looking at, and then looked at me with the expression of a man who has processed a great deal in his career, but retains the capacity to be quietly astonished by human ambition. He took my statement. He took Diane's. He took statements from 4 neighbors who had been standing in their driveways with their phones out since before we'd pulled in. The police report read like a checklist. Unlawful entry. Felony impersonation of law enforcement because those vests and that performance and those printed notices constituted exactly that under state statute. And the statute is not subtle on the point. Assault, conspiracy, criminal intimidation, property damage. I made copies of the report the same day. I emailed the full file to my office server, to a cloud backup, to Tom, a colleague who handles criminal defense and who, when I called him that evening and walked him through it, was quiet for a long moment and then said, "This is remarkable, and I mean that in the worst possible way for her." The 2 men in the vests cracked first, which was predictable. A costume is a costume. When the consequences become real and personal and measured in years rather than dollars, the costume comes off fast. Under questioning, they produced the messages without much resistance, not because they had particular civic virtue, but because the alternative had become worse than the cooperation, and they'd already done the math. Karen had directed the entire operation by text, the timing designed for maximum public visibility, the specific instructions about which items to remove and where to place them, the language to use if confronted, the explicit decision to break the lock rather than wait. Every instruction in writing, time-stamped, attributed, preserved in a medium that does not forget and cannot be edited after the fact. The man who had shoved Diane got 18 months in county for assault and criminal impersonation of law enforcement. His partner got 14 months, reduced in acknowledgement of his cooperation, and the messages he'd handed over that made Karen's case airtight before it even went to trial. Karen's case moved through the system with the grinding, patient, unglamorous pace that serious charges require. Her attorney was competent. Karen herself was, apparently confident right through the pretrial phase that something would intervene, a technicality, a sympathetic reading, some argument that hadn't been fully explored yet. What the prosecution had was a complete record, not assembled by investigators. Assembled by Karen herself, across weeks of texts and emails and HOA notices and recorded conversations, all of it cataloged and dated and cross-referenced, handed to the state in the form of a file that I had been building since the second afternoon she stood in my driveway. The judge's language at sentencing was precise and not particularly warm. Calculated abuse of authority, a sustained campaign of intimidation and criminal conspiracy motivated by greed and the desire for control. 3 years and 6 months in state prison. No early release provision. No magic exit. Restitution ordered at $186,000, property damage, stolen items, legal fees, emotional distress, punitive damages, all of it itemized and attached to the judgment like a long receipt for a purchase she'd made voluntarily. The HOA itself was fined $75,000 by the state for its institutional role in enabling the environment that made this possible. Board members who had spent the preceding months maintaining a careful and strategic silence about their own involvement began resigning within 48 hours of the fines being announced. Once the word lien stopped being abstract and started appearing on their own property records. The neighborhood changed quickly after that. Not in a dramatic way, not with speeches or ceremonies or any kind of formal acknowledgement of what had happened. It changed the way places change when the thing that was making people small gets removed. People stood in their driveways differently, made eye contact again. The woman who had been crossing the street to avoid Diane came over one evening with a bottle of wine and didn't quite apologize but said enough that it counted. A neighbor 2 houses down knocked on the door on a Sunday afternoon and told me he'd known something was wrong for months and hadn't known what to do about it and was sorry it had gone as far as it went. I told him I understood, and I meant it. Karen had been deliberate and practiced in the way she'd isolated people from each other. That's what that kind of operation depends on, keeping everyone convinced that they were the only one who saw it, the only one who doubted it, the only one who wasn't sure. Diane's back healed. 6 weeks of real soreness. Some physical therapy, a couple of nights where she'd shift in her sleep and I'd hear her wince and lie awake afterward running through the sequence of that afternoon in the specific unproductive way that minds do at 2 in the morning. By November, she was fine. The front door got a new frame, better hardware than the original, a lock that cost more than it needed to because I wanted it solid, and I wanted to know it was solid every time I closed it. The things that had been scattered across the lawn came back inside, almost all of them undamaged. Diane reorganized the second bedroom and finished unpacking the boxes that had been staged there since move-in. The house looked by late fall like a home that had been settled into fully, which was the thing we'd been working toward all along and had gotten to by a longer and stranger route than we'd planned. I still have the folder. Every letter, every timestamp, every fake notice with its red stamp and its invented authority. The photographs of the splintered door frame taken the afternoon, the police were still there. The full recording from the lawn, the police report, the sentencing documents, the restitution order with Karen's name on it and the number beneath it. The folder lives in a fireproof box in my home office behind a row of case files. And I don't open it often. I don't need to. But I keep it because documentation is a habit that is by now cellular in me, and because the record matters independent of whether anyone ever looks at it again. The record is the proof that it happened, and how it happened, and what it cost her. That's not nothing. That's actually the whole thing. Diane asked me once, maybe 6 weeks after the sentencing, sitting on the back porch on one of those November evenings that Vermont does where the cold is clean rather than brutal, and the sky goes dark early and the stars come out fast, whether I thought Karen had understood what she'd done. Not legally, we both understood the legal dimension completely, but whether she'd understood it in the way a person understands something that changes how they see themselves. I thought about it for a while before I answered. I said I didn't think Karen had ever genuinely believed she would lose. Not because she lacked intelligence, she didn't, and I want to be accurate about that, but because her entire operational model was built on a premise that had probably served her reliably for a long time. The premise that most people don't push back. That most people, when the pressure comes, will absorb it and pay to make it stop or go quiet or leave, because the cost of resistance is higher than the cost of compliance. And most people are trying to get through their days without adding new problems to the existing ones. She had probably run that play successfully more than once before us, maybe many times. It had worked right up until the morning she knocked on the door of someone whose professional life was built on exactly the kind of patience and paper trail she was generating, who found the whole situation more analytically interesting than frightening, and who had 20 years of practice at letting the other side build their own case while believing they were building leverage. She hadn't counted on that. You rarely count on the thing you haven't been shown to expect. On a Saturday morning in late spring, about 5 months after the sentencing, I was in the backyard with my coffee watching Diane in the pool, the deeper pool we'd put in during the renovation. The one we'd spent more on than was strictly necessary because we'd decided we were going to do it right, and the neighborhood was making all its normal sounds. A lawnmower somewhere on the next block. A kid's voice from a yard over. A dog stating opinions about something 2 houses down. The particular warm quiet of a Saturday morning in a place where people are going about their lives without anyone managing them. I sat there for a long time with my coffee going cold in my hand, and I didn't try to think anything specific. The sun was moving across the yard the way it does in late spring before the trees fully leaf out. Diane was doing her laps, the slow, steady kind she does when she's not exercising so much as thinking. Everything was ordinary and mine and earned. I went inside and made fresh coffee. I brought a cup out for Diane and left it on the edge of the pool where she could reach it. I sat back down in my chair. The morning did what mornings do. That's the whole story.